So this week we really begin talking about human people, human persons, and one of the things that's valuable, I think, before you do the readings or before you're really thinking through the readings, is to recognize kind of like the state of secular philosophy on the issue of human person and human identity. Because despite the fact that most people intuitively assume that they know what makes them a person or have human identity, or the same identity over time, that's actually been a big problem in philosophy, in Western philosophy specifically, for a long time. And so I just kind of wanted to just sort of bring you up to speed. And if you've got a background in philosophy, this might not be surprising to you, especially if your background is from a non-Christian or secular context. It's actually a little bit surprising. Basically, over the last probably 60 to 100 years, secular philosophy has undergone a kind of systematic, almost, approach to deconstructing the notion of human personhood. And the way that this happened is that in the 1600s, when René Descartes develops, his Cartesian dualism, where he kind of makes an argument to suggest that that the I, when I refer to I, I'm referring to a soul or an internal mental state, something like that. As soon as he's done that, there becomes this great question in Western philosophy, and that is, what is the I? And when I say me or I, the person that I'm talking about, what is it that grounds me? Okay, and to motivate that for a second, just think about what's happened is there's been a ton of different theories about what makes a human person a person. So let me just throw out a couple of them. You can begin really with the classical tradition, and in Christianity, Boethius promotes this, and that is that what makes a human being a person is the rational faculty, right? And so in ancient philosophy, and then in Christian philosophy for a long time, it was assumed that what makes a person, and often in Christian language you'd use the image of God. What the image of God is the intellect, or the ability for a human being to reason in a way that animals could not. And that's kind of what separates us from the animals. Now that will go under revision, and then at some point someone will come along and say it's not reason, it's emotion. Later and in the 20th century, it gets a little more complex. Ideas of like the ability for a human being to construct a plan and to execute it, or the ability of a human being to have a coherent sense of the self, or the ability of a human being to recognize that there is a self, like even the very idea of consciousness. That only human beings really have this, and this is what sets us apart. Later on, even into this last century, something like the unity of all of these things, reason, emotion, planning, consciousness, whatever it is. If you bring it all together, the unity of those things, that's what human personhood is. That's what makes human beings special. The big problem is that every single one of these things has been identified actually in the animal kingdom, the kingdom of the lower animals. And in one of the big things that Karkainen brings out in this week's reading is a transfer in theology from trying to figure out what makes human beings special and different from the rest of the created order to integrating human beings into a coherent notion of the created order. And we've talked about that before when we talked about creation. We talked about a theology of the natural world needs to integrate human beings into it rather than keep human beings special or separate or something like that. And the reason for this is that once you have a sophisticated notion of reason, emotion, planning, consciousness, even a unity of those things, you're going to find them in the animal kingdom. You're going to find them throughout the created natural order. There are animals that display reason. There are animals that display emotion, planning, consciousness, a sense of self, even some unity of all these things. They're not unique to human beings. And so if your notion of human personhood depends on them, then you're actually committing to a notion that not just are human beings persons, but also animals. And of course, if you are like most Westerners and you assume that personhood confers certain natural rights, suddenly you're requiring that the same rights that apply to human beings ought to apply to animals if you're going to be consistent in your thinking. And that's not right. Well, okay, it might be right, but it certainly goes against natural human intuition that there's something different, something special about humanity and human personhood. So if you can identify all of these things in lower animals, and you're still committed to a notion that there's something about humanity that's special, then you're in kind of a problem. You're not sure what makes a human being, a human person, a person, because there doesn't seem to be anything about human beings as such that is unique to human beings. Well, it gets worse, because not only has modern philosophy and really the natural sciences put the idea of personhood into question, they've also put the notion of personal identity into question. In philosophy, the question of personal identity is this: what is it that makes Tom the same in 1981 when he was born and today over time? So what is it that makes Tom the same person over time? What grounds my personal identity? How do I know that I'm the same person? Well, again, there's a number of major theories, and in the wake of the natural sciences and more and more disbelief among scientists in the notion of a soul, the typical answer is something like the substance continuity, the continuity of really this body. Now, there are some problems with that, because as you all know, or you should know, something like every 7 years, there's been a complete transformation of all the cells and atoms that make up this body. All the ones that were there 7 years ago are gone now, and they've been replaced by other cells, and through natural processes, like when I eat and then when I expel waste, my body's changing, and the body is, as it ages, is dispensing with old cells and replacing them with new cells, and so there is nothing, literally nothing, that is the same from a material perspective about me as the person I apparently was when I was born. There's no material substance. Now, that we can be a little more sophisticated. We can say, well, that's true, but at no time on there was there like a radical shift. So maybe there's like a kind of a slow, continuous process where as long as there's something the same before as now, and it's as long as the transformation is slow, then we can still claim some kind of identity. Well, even that is going to have problems, especially when philosophers start coming up with interesting like thought experiments. The classic is, so say you've this is from Greek philosophy. Say that you've got a boat. Your Greek captain has a war boat that he's going to use to invade Carthage or wherever he's going to invade. But he goes into war with it, and it gets damaged. And so he replaces one of the pieces of the boat with another piece, right? But what he does, though, is he saves the original piece. He saves it. He doesn't get rid of it. Instead, he puts it off to the side. And then he goes to war again with his boat that's been patched up, and it gets damaged again, and so he replaces another piece. And yet he saves the original piece after having replaced. And he does this over and over and over again until not only is the original boat, all the pieces been replaced, but he saved all those pieces, and he's kept them over here. And he's able to fix them up and polish them, and then he assembles them into a boat again. Well, which boat is his boat? Because all the materials from the original boat are over here, and they've been reassembled. And yet, over time, he was using the patched up boat, and so it seems like, and you could transfer this to human beings. Like imagine you had a machine where you could save all of the atoms, right, that are in Tom's body, and so over time you collect them, and then at a certain point you reassemble them. Right, after 7 years, you've collected all of the atoms that were in Tom's body at time X, and then you reassemble them. So now you have two bodies, right? There's Tom, who's been, naturally recycling, and then there's the Tom that you've saved all of his atoms and you've reconstructed them. You can see that there comes up some really weird problems if you think that that the matter is what creates continuity over time with a person. So yeah, weird problems there. So then the thought is, well, maybe it's not matter. Maybe it's not the continuity of substance that grants personal identity. So then there's other theories. I think John Locke was the first. I think it was John Locke who did the memory theory of identity. It says as long as at time A I can remember being me at in the past at time B, then I'm the same person. And there's problems with that too, because there's lots of things that I don't remember about my past. So was I not the same person when those things happened? And well, he anticipates this objection, and so he says, well, as long as there's a chain of memories, so that if at time A I remember being the person at time B, and at time B I remembered being the person at time C, and at time C I remembered being the person at time D, if there's a chain of memory, then we're the same person. Problem with that, of course, is that there are a lot of things that we don't remember, like being asleep, for example, or being in a coma. Literally every night, there's, depending on your sleep habits, between 4 and 10 hours of blank space that you don't remember at all. And so there's that question. Then, if you can't rely on memory, then how do you really know you're the same person when you wake up as the person who went to sleep? And actually, movies take advantage of this all the time. They come up with these weird plots where, like, a person wakes up and they're a different personality or something, and then the movie promotes a question. Well, maybe you really could become someone else if you lost all your memories. I think the Bourne movies are all about a guy who lost his memory and becomes somebody different. Is he really the same person? That's a problem. Another possibility is psychological continuity. So, on this view, because I have maintained some loose cluster of similar values or similar predispositions over time, if we could sort of categorize that character or that psychological sketch of Tom at time A, and we can match it to the person who calls himself Tom at time B, then those are the same people over time. Great idea, except that we've got some radical problems. For those of you who are familiar with the story of Phineas Gage, he was I think a steel worker in the early 1900s or maybe late 1800s, and Gage was working, and a piece of pipe went through his head, and he survived. But what people found out was that after this accident, after this damage to the brain, Gage was a radically different person. Before, Gage had been a very calm, mild-mannered, friendly guy, and then after the accident, he'd become really short, couldn't control his impulses, and seemed like an entirely different person. There have been a number of stories like this, and it usually involves brain damage. People who undergo catastrophic damage to different parts of their brain then experience different personalities as a result. I know a story of a young man who got into a car accident, and after the car accident found himself unable to control his impulses, and was saying and participating in some very naughty sexual things, which he never did before, never even desired to before. And so there's this radical disjunction between before and after the accident, before and after the brain injury, where the psychology of the person is fractured. And yet, intuitively, we look at that person, we want to say, you're not a different person. And so then we're forced into the position that psychological continuity does not actually account for what it is to be a person over time. David Hume, in the Enlightenment, developed something like, you might call it the Commonwealth view of personal identity. And that's, you think of a human being sort of like you think of a country, or a commonwealth. So say that in 1776 the United States is born, right? And the United States has a number of interesting characteristics. There's these people who are a part of it, and they all learn these types of things, and they exhibit these types of characteristics, and they enjoy these types of pastimes, and there's just this wide variety of things that characterize Americans, members of this Commonwealth. And not one of those things is universal. So it's not as though every single American has every single one of those characteristics, but this loose cluster over time is recognizably American, right? And so from 1776 to the present, there's something that's recognizably American, and that changes over time. But at no time is the collection radically different than before. And you can see, I mean, it's subject to this view is subject to the same issues as memory and as psychological continuity. There's, over time you have to wonder, has America become a different place, right? And you can imagine what it would look like if that were to happen. And yet, because it has the same name, you kind of wanted to say, well, it's still the same Commonwealth, still the same country, still the same geography, but it becomes different. It's just hard to know. It's hard to know if that theory actually helps us or if it just better demonstrates the problem. So, I mean, what's happened is that philosophers today, in general, very, very few philosophers believe that there is such a thing as a coherent self. Western philosophy tends to say that the self is an illusion, that you are really no more than a cluster of thoughts, predispositions, whatever, and you have an apparatus, a brain apparatus that imposes a sense of unity where none actually exists, and that's kind of where we're at. Moreover, they'll say that there is no such thing as personhood. If personhood is anything, it's sort of an arbitrary decision that we have made that if you have enough, rationality, emotion, planning, consciousness, all those different characteristics of personhood, if you've got enough of them together, you have what we call a rational agent who can make decisions and be held morally responsible. That's just, I mean, there's no there. It's just arbitrary. And moreover, I mean, if you take it to its logical conclusion, that means that people with, say, for example, severe cognitive limitations aren't really people at all. They're not persons because they're not rational agents. And so people with severe special needs, for example, would not qualify for personhood. Very young children, infants, probably up to the age of 2 or so, are not persons. And there are philosophers, there's a number of them, lots of them out there, who will say, yeah, those people should not be afforded rights because they're not really people. That's a pretty dark view of, and it's kind of where the trajectories of Western philosophy have taken us. When you have the natural sciences that are absolutely unconstrained by, or that have no unity imposed from a theological perspective, this is where you end up. This is exactly why I think Aquinas understood that theology must be the queen of the sciences, because theology is the only place where unity and coherence can be imposed in the domains of logic and argument over what we think of as the natural sciences, over what we think of as philosophy. Without a notion of God at the top, it really does look like a one-way street to despair. But as Christians, we don't despair. But I want you to recognize just how important Christian faith is to being able to make claims about personhood and identity. And moreover, I want us to stop making the mistake of the Enlightenment. Notice each kind of theory that I put forward there of personhood or of identity. What it was looking for this one thing, this special thing that only human beings have, that is autonomous, that is different from everything else in the created order, and notice, different, not dependent on God. Notice that every single one of those things is something that, whether God exists or not, you'd still be a person if that's what defined personhood. Or you'd still have personal identity over time if that's what defined personal identity over time. God is totally unnecessary on any of those views. And I don't think it's a coincidence that each of those views ultimately, I believe, leads towards nihilism. When when you really start to investigate. I don't think they hold up, and I think that if you are trying to define humanity apart from a creator and apart from the Christian tradition and story, I do think that you're going to probably end up at the end of the day with a council of despair. There is no self, there is no personal identity. It's an illusion. But thankfully we're Christians, and so we don't have to go down that road. But it does bring up the question, okay, let's just say you add God in to your cosmology. Let's just say you think that there's a God. How does that help? What is it that God brings to the table, as it were, and helps us when we're thinking from the perspective of theological anthropology to identify what it is to be a human person, or to have human personal identity over time as a human being? What is it that God brings to the table? And I think that there's two things. The first, and both of them are drawn, in my mind, from a lot of the theology of Wolfhart Pannenberg. And really, to be fair, I mean, he's simply walking into a tradition that probably begins with Augustine. You see it in Luther, and then again in Duns Scotus in the Scottish Enlightenment. Every single one of these thinkers, if you look at their theology, they have a radical dependence on God, and so they don't think humanity apart from divinity. In fact, what they do, and I think it's the right way to go, is they flip the question upside down. Rather than saying, oh, because this is typically how arguments go, they say, well, this is what a human being is. And then we're going to say, okay, now we know something about God, because God is, humans are created in God's image, and so we know what humans are, we know what the image of God is. Now we can tell you something about God, right? And this is one of the ways that people have traditionally tried to reason out the character and nature of God. They'll say, well, we know a human being is a rational animal, whatever. Reason is really important. And then they'll say, well, since reason is really important, and human beings are made in the image of God, we know that God has higher, infinite, eternal, perfect reason, right? So we've taken a view about humanity and then projected that onto divinity. Well, that won't work for these thinkers, Augustine especially, and Luther especially. They have such a radical notion of human dependence on God that they say, let's not start with humanity and think about divinity. Let's instead think about divinity and see what that tells us about humanity. And there's two, I think, major things that these thinkers develop that I think is really constructive and really valuable as we try and discern what it is that a human person is, and what it is that makes us the same over time. And the first is that because we know the end, we can say that God, in God's mind, God holds a narrative unity together in a human person. That God knows every person's story, start to finish. And what that means is that you, at any moment, at any given time, are not whole. That's just a slice of you, as it were. What you are as a person is the whole time worm, you might think. Like, you come into existence at a time, and then you go through the 4 dimensions, the 3 dimensions that we see, and the 4th dimension, which is time, and possibly other dimensions. The physicists say there's more. Who knows? But you're moving through, and what makes that you is that God has the whole thing known, and God sustains and provides for the whole thing. The reason God is necessary is because we need to know the end. Okay, at any given time, there is no narrative unity on a person that's unless it's imposed by a person, him or herself. Right now, I could tell you the story of who I am, but this would be an arbitrary telling. It would be me selecting what I think is important about my life right now, which is different than what I thought was important about my life before. And the story that I'm telling you has a beginning, middle, and an end that ends right now, but it doesn't take into account what's going to happen in the future. Tomorrow I could be in a catastrophic accident and lose, brain function and whatever, and yet, God can still tell the story of me start to finish. God knows what the narrative unity of my life looks like. And God holds that in eternity. Moreover, we know, because we're Christians, what human life is ultimately going to be conformed to. This is important. If you want to say that there's a narrative unity, a story to human life, you need to have a beginning, you need to have a middle, and you need to have an end. You need to know how it ends up in order to have coherence, in order to have unity. A story is only a good story if it's coherent, if it really has a plot that goes from here and gets to here. Well, Christian doctrine tells us we have a preview of what the end is. And the end is the self-giving God of the cross, to whom all human lives are conformed. I know that in the eschatology, the end, the final consummation of all things, I know whose image I am going to be conformed to. His name is Jesus. He lived. We have witnesses about him. We know what he was like. And I'm going to be like that too. And so whatever else happens in life, that beginning, middle, and end, it remains. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. That unity exists. God knows it. God sustains it in some miraculous way through the Spirit. God creates it. And so I can say with confidence that I have a self and a personhood, because I have a complete unity to my life, a coherent narrative of my existence. Another thing that bringing God into the picture helps us do is we can look at God's being and we can reason Trinitarianly. We can say, we know that God's Trinity. We know what personhood is by reflecting on God, from whom all personhood is derived, right? And what's interesting about the Godhead is that we know that the Godhead lives in relational unity and difference. Unity and difference over time. That God is eternally self-differentiating into Father, Son, Spirit, and God is eternally unified in the bond of love that is the Spirit. And we can say, based on that, we can derive from that a notion of human personhood or identity that is relational. Relational first with God, and then relational with each other. We know also that because we're going to be conformed to the image of the Son, and we're going to participate in divine life in the end of days, that we are being drawn into that unity and self-differentiation. That's not just an abstract concept. It is actually our destiny. And so not only does that help us impose a narrative unity where we know the end, and so we know the significance and the meaning of the middle and the beginning of our lives, but it also creates it shows us what's valuable about human life now, namely its relation to God, who is eternally different, and yet draws us into union, and with each other, we are different persons, but we're drawn into community and union in the Spirit, in the church. So those are two different ways that adding God into our cosmology can give us coherence and give us hope for salvaging some notion of human personhood and the continuity of personal identity over time. Because we have a relational triune God who knows the end and has demonstrated the end in the event of his Son, we can create narrative unity, and we can recognize the importance of relationality to the divine and to each other as what makes us human beings who are the same over time, and persons of value. However, all of this does implicate other aspects of theology and philosophy, because if it's the case, this is just an example, but you could multiply it if you really wanted to think about it, but just an example. If you say that what confers personhood on people is the narrative unity that requires a recognition of the end of all human lives, or at least Christian lives, being conformed to the image of the Son, if that's what confers personhood, then you have to wonder if a person who is not destined to be conformed to the image of the Son is a person at all. And that brings up a question of soteriology. If you believe that not all people are going to heaven, if you believe that there are people for whom whatever reason they are not in the end ultimately conformed to the image of the Son, then you are saying that they're not people at all, if you buy into this notion of personhood, that it's conferred by God based on a narrative unity of a whole or complete human life. You'd have to say that a person whose life does not end in conformity to the image of the Son, that life is incoherent, and because it's incoherent, it lacks personhood, and is not a person. That's a big deal. That's a major problem, especially if you're a Western Christian who more or less buys into the notion of human beings as possessors of certain rights based on being a human person, because you're saying that they're not, and they probably don't have those rights. That's a fiction. That's a big deal. The only reason I bring that up is not to make us worry about whether or not non-Christians are actually people. I think they probably are, although it's worth thinking about. But to indicate that whatever you do when you're trying to develop a human anthropology and a theological anthropology is to recognize that whatever you say about human beings is going to have radical implications. It's going to have implications in your doctrine of sin. It's going to have implications for your doctrine of who God is, what God's like. It's not as though you're doing theology in silos, right? I'm just going to worry about humanity today, and then I'm going to forget about it and do something else. No, whatever you say about what makes us us and what makes us valuable is going to have implications for a whole host of other doctrines. And in this particular case, I think it's worth thinking through. Do you believe? What is it that makes a human being a person? What is it that makes us a coherent person? What is it that makes me over time? However you answer that question is going to matter a whole lot when you start thinking about the end of days, when you start thinking about what's valuable about us, and ultimately the image of God, which will be the subject of the next lecture. All right, thank you.